August 17, 1944, 09:30 hours. A field hospital behind the lines, Tinian. The world returned to Private Kenji Tanaka, not with the blinding light of heaven, nor the fiery torment he had been promised, but with a smell. It was a thick, savory, impossible smell of cooked meat. For a moment he thought it was a hallucination, a final cruel trick of a starving mind. His last coherent memory was of the dirt, the bitter taste of volcanic soil kicked up by the mortar shell that had torn through his leg and thrown him into darkness. Before that, for months, the only taste had been boiled roots, the occasional lizard, and the gnawing, acidic emptiness in his stomach. He forced an eye open. The world was canvas, a muted green tent ceiling swaying gently. He was on a cot, a real cot, and a rough wool blanket covered him. The phantom weight of his Arisaka rifle was gone from his shoulder. His uniform, the sweat-stained and tattered garment he had worn for a year, was also gone, replaced by loose-fitting pajamas. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of his concussion. He was a captive, the final shame, the ultimate dishonor prescribed by the Senjin-kun military code. Do not live to experience the shame of a prisoner. He tried to sit up, but a searing pain shot from his bandaged leg. A figure loomed over him, an American, a giant with a pale freckled face and reddish hair, not the horned demon from the propaganda posters. Kenji's hand instinctively went to his waist for the grenade that was no longer there. His final duty was to take one of the enemy with him. He had failed. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the bayonet or the bullet. This was the moment of execution. He thought of his mother in Kagoshima, her last letter, now just a worn-out crease of paper in a pocket he no longer possessed, speaking of the persimmon harvest. But the final blow never came. Instead, there was a soft clinking sound. He dared to look again. The American medic was not holding a weapon. He was holding a small metal can and a spoon. He pried the lid off, and the impossible smell intensified. It was greasy, salty, and overwhelmingly rich. The medic scooped a small piece of the pink processed meat and held it out. Kenji stared. He had watched his comrades, men he had trained with, wither away on this rock. He had seen the madness of hunger in their eyes. Their officers had told them the Americans were weak, decadent, and running out of supplies. That one final glorious charge, Gyokusai, would shatter their fragile morale. Yet here was a simple soldier, a medic, casually offering him more meat in one spoonful than he had seen in 6 months. It was not a weapon of steel that began to dismantle Kenji Tanaka's entire world. It was a can of spiced ham. And in that moment of profound, jarring confusion, he realized that everything he had been taught about the enemy, about the war and about his own destiny, was a catastrophic lie. The Imperial Japanese Army that marched across Asia and the Pacific in the early 1940s was an entity of profound contradictions. On one hand, it was a force of incredible discipline, courage, and tactical ingenuity, capable of stunning victories that humbled Western colonial powers. On the other, it was an organization built upon a logistical framework of almost criminal neglect. The paradox of the Japanese war machine was that it was designed for swift, decisive battles, with little to no planning for protracted campaigns of attrition. Spirit, it was believed, could conquer material deficiencies. This philosophy was woven into the very fabric of its military doctrine. The soldier of the emperor was expected to endure hardships that would break other armies. He was taught that to demand more was a sign of weakness, a stain on his honor. Consequently, the logistical chain of the IJA was notoriously fragile. While the American military calculated troop needs in tons of supplies per man per day, the Japanese often calculated in ounces. Ammunition was always the priority. Food was a distant second. The soldier was expected to shokuryo wa genchi chotatsu o gensoku to su, to forage for food locally. This policy worked, however, brutally, in the fertile lands of China or Burma. But on the tiny, barren volcanic islands of the Central Pacific, there was nothing to forage. There was only coral, sand, and the enemy. As the American war machine gained momentum, its island-hopping strategy transformed this logistical weakness into a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Under the command of Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur, U.S. forces would bypass and isolate heavily fortified Japanese strongholds, like Rabaul or Truk, leaving their massive garrisons to wither on the vine. On these islands, cut off from all resupply, Japanese soldiers descended into a primitive struggle for survival. Their war was no longer against the Americans, but against their own bodies. Diaries recovered from these garrisons speak of a monotonous diet of roots, snails, and insects. As the months turned into years, they speak of the green sickness of malnutrition, of men whose bodies swelled with beriberi, and of the ultimate taboo, cannibalism. This physical ordeal was reinforced by an unbending psychological doctrine. The Senjin-kun, a military code issued in 1941 by War Minister Hideki Tojo, was distributed to every single soldier. It was an update to the older imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, but with a harder, more fanatical edge forged for a total war. Its most famous and most lethal injunction was the one concerning capture. It stated plainly, "Be resolved to die rather than to undergo the humiliation of being taken prisoner." This was not mere suggestion. It was a sacred command. Surrender was not a strategic option. It was a spiritual failure, an act that brought shame upon oneself, one's family, and the emperor himself. This ethos fueled the terrifying spectacle of the Banzai Charge, where Japanese units, often depleted of ammunition and food, would fix bayonets and charge to their deaths. It also explained the shocking rarity of Japanese prisoners. In the Guadalcanal campaign, for every one Japanese soldier captured, over 100 were killed. On Tarawa, of a garrison of nearly 5,000, only 17 Japanese soldiers were taken alive. To be a captive was to be socially and spiritually dead, a non-person erased from family records back home. The soldier was prepared for death, for starvation, for sacrifice. He was utterly unprepared for mercy. For Private Kenji Tanaka, the end had been choreographed since the day he received his draft notice. He knew his role was to become a single cherry blossom, beautiful in its brief life, destined to fall gloriously for the emperor. The reality, however, had been anything but poetic. His war on Tinian was a squalid affair of hiding in caves by day, enduring thunderous naval bombardments, and watching his comrades die not only from American shells, but from dysentery, infection, and the slow, grinding erosion of starvation. The final charge was not a glorious, coordinated assault. It was a ragged, stumbling collection of skeletal men, some armed only with sharpened bamboo spears, fueled by a last ration of sake and the dregs of their fanaticism. Kenji remembered the guttural, desperate screams of his comrades as they ran into the sweeping fire of Browning machine guns. He remembered firing his rifle until the bolt clicked on an empty chamber. He remembered the face of the young American Marine, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and grim necessity. Before the world erupted in a cascade of earth and fire, waking up in enemy hands was a disorientation beyond the physical. His entire being, every fiber of his training and indoctrination, screamed at him that this was wrong. He was supposed to be dead. Lying on the cot, he felt a shame so profound it was a physical weight, heavier than the pain in his leg. He was a failure. He meticulously went over the options for suicide. He could bite off his own tongue and drown in the blood. He could refuse food and water. He could attack a guard, hoping to be shot. Death was the only path back to honor. He lay there, surrounded by the quiet, efficient movements of the American medical staff. They spoke in low, calm tones. They changed his bandages with a detached professionalism that was somehow more unnerving than open hostility. They did not mock him. They did not torture him. They treated his wounds, gave him water, and left him to his thoughts. This clinical, impersonal mercy was a form of psychological torment he could never have anticipated. His commanders had spoken of the Americans as beasts, savages who mutilated the dead and tortured the living. This quiet, sterile environment, this methodical saving of his life, was a contradiction that his mind could not resolve. He waited for the interrogation. He steeled himself to give them nothing, to protect the codes and unit positions that were now, he vaguely realized, already strategically worthless. He anticipated the questions, the threats, the pain. The only thing he could not anticipate was kindness. For the average American GI or Marine fighting in the Pacific, the Japanese soldier was an almost supernatural foe. He did not behave according to the established rules of Western warfare. He did not surrender when his position was hopeless. He would hide in a spider hole with a grenade, waiting to take his killer with him. He would feign injury to lure in a medic before detonating a hidden charge. The refusal to be taken prisoner created a brutal feedback loop. Because Japanese soldiers so rarely surrendered, American troops became conditioned to fight to the finish, often not making the distinction between a soldier wanting to give up and one feigning surrender for a final attack. The taking of a Japanese prisoner was a rare and hazardous event. It often only occurred when a soldier was knocked unconscious or so severely wounded he was physically incapable of resistance or suicide. The command structure, however, operated on a different level. while the frontline soldier was driven by the instinct of survival and the grim realities of combat. American leadership, from the strategic planners in Washington down to division commanders, understood the value of prisoners. A living captive was a font of intelligence. He could provide information on unit strength, fortifications, morale, and future plans. Therefore, official U.S. policy, dictated by the laws of war and the 1929 Geneva Convention, was to treat all prisoners humanely. Though Japan was not a signatory to the convention concerning the treatment of POWs, America was. Adhering to it was a matter of national honor, military discipline, and pragmatism. Propagandists saw the value in showing the world, and potentially the Japanese people, that America was a humane power. Leaflets were designed and dropped over Japanese-held islands, showing smiling, well-fed Japanese prisoners in American camps, urging them to surrender. These efforts were almost entirely fruitless against the wall of Japanese military indoctrination, but the policy remained. The process for handling a captured soldier like Kenji was methodical. First, he would be disarmed and searched. Then, he would be given immediate medical attention at a battalion aid station. The priority was to save his life, not just for humanitarian reasons, but to preserve an intelligence asset. From there, he would be moved back to a divisional clearing station and then to a field hospital. The interrogations would begin, conducted by specially trained Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, who served as translators and intelligence specialists. These interrogators quickly learned that brutality was counterproductive. A prisoner who had been indoctrinated to expect torture would shut down. But kindness, a cigarette, a hot meal, these were the unexpected tools that could begin to pry open a mind sealed shut by years of propaganda. For the American war machine, a Japanese POW was not just a defeated enemy. He was a puzzle to be unlocked, and the key, more often than not, was a simple demonstration of humanity. Kenji Tanaka's journey from the brink of death on Tinian to the heart of the American mainland was a voyage through layers of disbelief. After a few days in the field hospital, he and a handful of other captives, all wounded, were moved to a transport ship. The first shock was the ship itself. It was a vast, clean, orderly vessel, a floating fortress of steel. He watched American sailors, young men his own age, laughing and talking as they went about their duties. They were not the gaunt, desperate figures of his own army. They were tall, muscular, and radiated an aura of effortless health. Then came the food. 3 times a day, the smell of cooking would waft through the sick bay. It was not the thin, watery rice gruel he was used to, but the aroma of baking bread, roasting meat, and brewing coffee. On his first full day at sea, a mess orderly brought him a tray. On it was a piece of fried fish, a scoop of mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, and a thick slice of white bread with a pat of yellow butter melting into it. Kenji stared at the tray for a full minute, his mind unable to process the sight. This was not a meal. It was a feast, a banquet beyond his wildest imaginings. The butter alone represented a level of decadent luxury that was alien to him. He ate slowly, suspiciously, his shrunken stomach cramping at the sudden richness. He watched as some of the Americans finished their meals and scraped leftovers into a bin, an amount of food that could have sustained his entire squad for a day. The casualness of the waste was as stunning as the abundance itself. After a journey of several weeks, they docked in San Francisco. Under guard, the prisoners were herded onto a train. As it rumbled across the continent, Kenji stared out the window. He saw vast, open landscapes of farmland, cities that showed no signs of bombing or rationing, roads teeming with civilian cars. This was the enemy homeland he had been told was collapsing under the strain of war. It looked prosperous, powerful, and utterly untouched by the conflict. His final destination was a place called Camp McCoy, in a state named Wisconsin. It was surrounded by green forests and rolling hills. There were no crumbling bunkers or muddy trenches. There were rows of neat wooden barracks, manicured lawns, and even a baseball diamond. He saw other Japanese prisoners, hundreds of them, walking freely within the wire. They were not in rags. They wore clean American-issued work clothes. They were not emaciated. They were healthy, their faces filled out, some even looking slightly overweight. This was not a prison camp as he understood it. It was a strange, inverted world, a place where the logic of war had been turned completely on its head. He had been shipped from the hell of the front lines into a bizarre parody of civilian life, and the greatest shock was yet to come, the daily routine of the mess hall. The bell rang for the midday meal, Following the other prisoners in a dazed, shuffling line, Kenji entered the mess hall at Camp McCoy. It was a long, cavernous wooden building that smelled of soap, roasted meat, and fresh bread. He picked up a partitioned steel tray, a fork, and a spoon. As he moved down the line, American servers in white aprons, themselves prisoners of a different sort, conscientious objectors or men with minor infractions, piled his tray high. First, a ladle of thick, steaming beef stew, loaded with chunks of meat, potatoes, and carrots. Next, 2 thick slices of freshly baked white bread, then a scoop of coleslaw. At the end of the line, a woman placed a slice of apple pie on his tray, and a cook handed him a mug of hot coffee, gesturing to large dispensers of milk and sugar nearby. Kenji stood frozen for a moment, his tray heavy in his hands. He looked at the meal. The sheer caloric weight of it was staggering. This was not a special occasion. This was Tuesday lunch. He found a seat at a long wooden table. Around him, the other prisoners ate with a quiet intensity. There was no talking. The only sounds were the scraping of forks and the sipping of coffee. For these men, the mess hall was a temple. Kenji took his first bite of the stew. The flavor was explosive. He ate the bread, which was soft and sweet. He had never tasted pie before. The combination of sweet apples and cinnamon was a revelation. He drank the coffee, sweetened with 2 cubes of sugar, and lightened with milk. An unimaginable luxury. In the weeks that followed, the routine of abundance became a relentless assault on his ideology. Breakfast was eggs, sausage, toast with jam, and oatmeal. Dinner might be roasted pork, chicken, or spaghetti with meatballs. There was always rice, not the gritty brown rationed rice of the army, but polished white rice served in unlimited quantities. There was fruit, vegetables, desserts, and endless coffee. He learned that the camp regulations, dictated by the Geneva Convention, required that prisoners of war be given a diet equivalent to that of the base's garrison troops. One day, he saw a notice pinned to the mess hall bulletin board. It was a weekly menu. He sounded out the English words, which he had begun to learn. Monday, meatloaf. Tuesday, beef stew. Wednesday, fried chicken. It was then that the full, crushing weight of the truth descended upon him. He and his comrades had been starving on their island fortresses, told that their sacrifice was draining a decadent and fragile America. But the reality was that America's problem was not scarcity, but surplus. This nation could fight a global war on 2 fronts and still have enough food to fatten its prisoners. The sheer, overwhelming, and casual might of American agriculture and industry was on display 3 times a day on his dinner tray. This was not a weapon he could fight. It was a truth he could not deny. The war had been lost long before he had ever fired his rifle. It had been lost in the wheat fields of Kansas, the stockyards of Chicago, and the sprawling factories of Detroit. And the proof was right here on his plate. The effect of this overwhelming abundance on the Japanese prisoners was not uniform, but it was universally profound. For some, the initial shock gave way to a deep, unshakable depression. Their entire universe of belief in the divinity of the emperor, the sacred mission of Japan, and their own spiritual superiority had been built on a foundation of lies. The shame of surrender, which had been their primary emotional state upon capture, was slowly replaced by a confusing sense of betrayal. They had been betrayed by their own leaders, who had sent them to die for a cause that was not only failing, but was based on a complete misunderstanding of the enemy. These men became quiet, withdrawn, and listless, their inner world shattered beyond repair. For others, the cognitive dissonance was too great. They clung to their indoctrination with renewed ferocity. The good food and fair treatment had to be a trick, a clever form of American psychological warfare designed to weaken their spirit. They would organize clandestine meetings, reaffirm their oaths to the emperor, and plan futile acts of resistance or mass suicide to reclaim their lost honor. In some camps, like the Featherston prisoner of war camp in New Zealand, this tension would erupt into violence in what became known as the Featherston Incident, where prisoners and guards were killed in a riot born of cultural misunderstanding and despair. But for a third group, which included Kenji Tanaka, the experience prompted a slow, painful, but ultimately transformative reevaluation of the world. The daily evidence of American power, demonstrated not through violence but through sustenance, began to deconstruct their former identity. The camp authorities fostered this process. They offered Japanese-language newspapers that presented an uncensored view of the war's progress, showing the relentless American advance across the Pacific. They showed movies, not just propaganda, but Hollywood films that depicted an American life of incredible freedom and material comfort. Kenji began to talk to the Nisei interpreters. He asked them questions, not about military matters but about America. He learned about democracy, about elections, about the concept of individual rights. It was an ideology as alien to him as the food on his plate. He began to understand that the Americans were not the one-dimensional demons he had been taught to hate. They were a complex people, capable of both incredible violence and incredible generosity. The shame of being a prisoner began to fade, replaced by a nascent curiosity and a growing realization that survival was not a disgrace. To have died for the lie would have been the true shame. The most effective re-education program was not a lecture or a pamphlet. It was the undeniable daily reality of the camp itself, which proved that everything he had been prepared to die for was fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. The total number of Japanese prisoners of war held by the Western Allies was small, just over 50,000 by the end of the war, a trivial figure compared to the millions of German and Italian POWs. Most were captured in the final desperate year of the conflict, as the Japanese war machine disintegrated. Yet, the strategic and psychological impact of their treatment resonated far beyond their numbers. The humane conditions in the camps became a key tool in Allied psychological operations. Leaflets dropped on beleaguered Japanese garrisons contained messages and photographs from captured comrades, describing the good food and medical care, assuring them that surrender was not a death sentence. While these efforts rarely induced mass surrenders, they planted seeds of doubt and may have saved individual lives, both Allied and Japanese. More significantly, the experience of these prisoners laid a strange and unexpected foundation for the post-war era. When the war ended, and these men were finally repatriated to a Japan that was a landscape of ash and ruin, they returned as changed individuals. They had seen, with their own eyes, the industrial and agricultural colossus that Japan had so foolishly challenged. They understood, in a way their countrymen could not, the true reason for their nation's defeat. While many faced ostracism upon their return, viewed as disgraced men who had failed in their duty to their unique perspective became a small but important part of Japan's post-war reconstruction and its eventual embrace of democracy and pacifism. For Private Kenji Tanaka, returning to Kagoshima in 1946 was another form of shock. His family had been told he had died honorably in battle on Tinian. His reappearance was a miracle tainted by the shame of his survival, but he carried within him a truth that was undeniable. He had seen the other side and knew that the path of militarism led only to ruin and starvation. In the end, the story of the Japanese POWs in American camps is a powerful lesson in the nature of warfare. It demonstrates that a nation's strength is not measured solely by the fanaticism of its soldiers or the power of its weapons, but also by the depth of its resources, the resilience of its logistics, and the power of its ideals. The United States entered the war with a staggering material advantage, but in the quiet, orderly confines of camps like McCoy, it deployed a different kind of weapon, one of overwhelming abundance and unexpected humanity. For the few Japanese soldiers who experienced it, this weapon did more than just ensure their survival. It dismantled their entire reason for fighting. It proved that a war can be won not only by killing your enemy, but by showing him with irrefutable clarity that his cause is already lost. The most decisive battle for Kenji Tanaka's soul was not fought with tanks and artillery on the beaches of Tinian, but with a fork and a spoon in the heart of the American Midwest.